This is Street Knowledge with Chris Graham.
Welcome to the podcast. Chris Graham, co-host Scott German here on a Friday, and we got sad news to talk about. George Welsh, the legendary former UVA football coach, he retired as the ACC's all-time winningest coach in 2000. Revived a program. I don't even know if you can say revived a program. He breathed life into a program that really didn't have life when he took over in 1982. He passed away on Wednesday at the age of 85, and condolences coming in from across the sports world, of course, from Wahoo Nation, and we wanted to cover George's career in this podcast, and also share some thoughts. I mean, some anecdotes from interactions with Coach Welsh, and of course, try to just talk about the impact that he had, not just on the football field but elsewhere. So Scott, Coach Welsh hired in 1982. Virginia had 2 winning seasons in the previous 29. By year 3, he has Virginia in a bowl game. You were at that bowl game, that Peach Bowl, and so you covered the Virginia football program closely in those early years. Can you overstate how big of a job this was in that year 3? That must have been. I mean, I think I was in 6th or 7th grade that year. As a kid growing up who knew he wanted to be a UVA student. That was a giddy year for me as a kid. What was it like around the program? I mean, George takes over this terrible program and leads it to the promised land. What were those early years like with Coach Welsh?
It was fun because I was just getting started in covering sports. I always grew up loving sports, loving UVA sports. My father was an usher. And not an usher, well, he eventually became an usher, but early on in his life, he would talk programs at Scott Stadium. When you could get in, he told me before he died. So I really enjoyed following UVA football, even as a kid. And you're right, when you say revived UVA football, that's not anywhere near. UVA, he built UVA football. There was no reviving. This football program was a downtrodden program, with the exception of a few years, randomly few years. This program was at the bottom of the pile, year in and year out, and it was just a carousel of coaches coming in. Every coach having a promise to make UVA football good, good, not great, good, and it was just an ongoing coaching change from. It seemed like about every 3 years the program would make a change and bring in somebody new. So when Coach Welsh came in from Navy, of all places, I know I, for one, wasn't overly impressed. And those of us who followed Coach Welsh, he was not a grandiose person. He downplayed everything. He was not this person that wanted to have the spotlight. He avoided the spotlight. And the program kind of took on his character, too. But he, no doubt, he had a tremendous impact. He built Virginia football. I would dare say that if it wasn't for Coach George Welsh, what we have today would certainly not exist. And he had an impact on a lot of people. A lot of people that probably that never even met him in person. It's a sad day in Virginia sports, and I'm sure, across the land there's going to be a lot of outpouring of people's thoughts and condolences about losing such a great person, more so than a great coach.
I'm thinking chronologically, and I'm still the kid in the 6th or 7th grade kid that year. And in fact, the year before too, the second season of Coach Welsh's tenure, Virginia started 4-0, and having grown up a UVA sports fan, a kid who wanted to go to school at UVA. Even I knew that from an early age. I don't know how that is, but I just knew from an early age I was going to be a UVA student, UVA alum. To see that grow the way it did, and I had a couple of older cousins who were UVA fans. One who got to go to a few games, and so it was that was a family thing, and And I'm reading a story from Jerry Ratcliffe. We are, of course, our sister website, jerryratcliffe.com. And Jerry is actually, as we're recording this podcast, he's on his way back from Atlanta. And so I hopefully he'll be able to cover some of this in his radio show tomorrow, the Jerry Ratcliffe Show, which airs on the ESPN stations in Charlottesville. But I'm reading something that I really never knew before. From Jerry wrote a column a few weeks ago about the '84 Peach Bowl. That was Virginia's first bowl game. '84. We played our first bowl game, and that was in Welsh's third year. And Virginia finished that year 8-2-2, but what the story mentions is that there was an early season win, or I guess a midseason win against Virginia Tech. And Jerry says that George told him many times over his career that if Virginia had won that game against Tech, he's not sure they would have made a bowl that season. And he thinks if they hadn't made a bowl that season, he might have either quit or gotten fired that year. Because, I mean, we'd seen it. Scott, as you mentioned, I mean, there were a succession of coaches that tried and failed, and Virginia was getting frustrated with the lack of success. And so, you think about it. I mean, George ends up coaching for 18 years. His last 13, Virginia won at least 7 games all those years. There was 3 weeks at number 1 in 1990. I was a first-year student at UVA in 1990. I, like Scott, we were both in the stadium watching a number 1 Virginia football team play football in Charlottesville in a game I'll never forget. A game Virginia lost, but a game I'll never forget. And but it all comes down to, in George's mind, it comes down to one game. Beating Virginia Tech, fittingly beating Virginia Tech in the game. Virginia, of course, then won that bowl game against Purdue. That was a pretty good Purdue team. Jim Everett was a quarterback. Rod Woodson was a cornerback on that team. Rod Woodson, Hall of Famer. He was a Boilermaker safety. And so Virginia got on track, and then 2 ACC championships, 1989, 1995. The memorable win over Florida State in 1995. But I'm jumping around, Scott. You got a story. You've told me this story. In fact, we were talking about this last week when we were at the Belk Bowl. A funny story about George and the post-game press conference after Virginia had lost to Georgia Tech with that number 1 ranking, and it kind of some interesting insight into George's thinking. I want you to share this story. I don't want to say anything more. You share the story, George's that press conference after that loss to Georgia Tech.
Well, that kind of makes me chuckle a little bit. So, we were number 1 in the nation, had a national television audience. I think you were at the game as a student, maybe?
Yeah,
is that right?
Yeah, student, first-year student.
Just an absolutely gut-wrenching loss to Georgia Tech. And I think at the time, Virginia had been ranked number 1 in the nation, consensus number 1. And back then, there wasn't 35 different polls. There were a couple polls. And Virginia was number 1 in both. And just a jam-packed media room, media all across the country. I'm not even sure who asked the question, but one of the first questions, if not the first question, presented to George for a media member was, okay, you just come off the field, your team's number 1 in the nation, you just come off a gut-wrenching loss. What's your media thoughts? What are your initial thoughts? Something to that loud. And George looked bewildered for a couple of seconds and then said, wow, I tell you what, that was a lot of pressure being number 1. Kind of glad it's over with. And it was almost a stunned silence in the media room. Look, I don't know if people couldn't believe what they had heard, what they just heard, or if they heard it right, but the press conference then continued to move on, and I think that kind of was symbolic of the way George was. He wasn't a person. Yeah, it hurt him. I know that was. He was a competitor, but he kind of put things in perspective, and it was a great deal. It was a great deal of pressure from fans because we weren't used to handling such lofty expectations and getting all that media. It was a tremendous amount of pressure. I don't know if he meant it, directly, like, yeah, it would have been better. I'm glad we lost. All the pressure is on. I think he just it's kind of symbolic of who George was. He wasn't the person that went out and sought limelight. He wasn't the person that that went out and tried to make the story about him. Another personal story about George is that, I don't know if you remember this, Chris, but some of our listeners probably do. Every Sunday morning, local TV stations, they would do a UVA highlight show. And George would be in a studio with some host that had to do that, because George hated that. He hated doing that. And the host that I was friends with at the time was Tom Delaney. I don't know if you remember Tom.
I do remember. Yeah.
Chris, he was. I think he started off in Harrisonburg, later moved to Charlottesville, then left the sports media industry. But Tom said that was the most difficult, because they often take that show late Saturday night, either when the team got back home from a away game or relatively close to the end of the game. And George hated that. He just hated doing it. He didn't like to be in front of the cameras for that long. And his answer to he was not a very good personality in front of the camera. He was like pulling teeth, getting a response from George, and that's just who he was. He wasn't a person that wasn't an attention seeker. He went about, did his work, did it the right way, and as I said, he didn't revive Virginia football. He built Virginia football.
9-9 record in his 18 years against Virginia Tech. We have gone 1-18 since. And he won 8 of 12 from 87 to 98, 5 of 6 from 87 to 92, and so he beat the rival. I saw comments from Frank Beamer today. A couple of reporters reached out to him to get some comments on George, and Frank noted that Virginia Tech used Virginia as a model. Virginia Tech had fallen at Virginia was never good before George Welsh. 2 winning seasons in the previous 29. Tech had some good runs and had some down years, and when Frank Beamer took over in, I think it was 86, Virginia Tech they were coming off probation. There were some other issues. It was not a good job, and Beamer famously, I think it was after year 6, almost got fired, and they gave him another year, and he did well, and they became Virginia Tech. They just had their first losing season since that year 6 or 7, just this year, losing the bowl game, the military bowl game. But Coach Beamer said, Virginia, what George Welsh did at Virginia, and we wanted to catch up to them. And so Mike Burnop, the longtime color commentator, I saw a comment from him, color commentator for Virginia Tech football. He said that I'm trying to think of the comment here. In fact, I've probably got it in the story. I posted a story with comments from all over Wahoo Nation and the rest of the sports world, but in effect, something very similar. That let's see here if I can find that real quick. The comment from Burnop was, I thought it was just really interesting, because I've said this for years and years. And it was actually Bill Roth, the former longtime play-by-play guy, that said this. He showed us that Virginia high school kids could play championship football. And Beamer took that, and then there were the great recruiting battles between those two for many years. And you think about all those players, Scott, from the 80s and 90s that played for George Welsh. So many of them were Virginia guys: Terry Kirby, Chris Slade, Tiki Barber, Rondé Barber, Thomas Jones, James Ferrier, Jamie Sharper. And I'm leaving lots. Anthony Poindexter. I'm leaving lots of guys out when I go down that list. They were all Virginia guys, Virginia high school players, AA and AAA, and some single A. Heath Miller, who didn't play for George much, but because George retired in 2000, and Heath, came to be known more as an Al Groh guy, but he was recruited by George and his staff. All these guys were Virginia high school players, and so the emergence of Virginia football showed the rest of the country that Virginia high school football was pretty good. And now Virginia is looked at as one of the top 5 or 6 states in the country in terms of producing high school talent. George Welsh was key to that. So him building this program here was really important, not just for UVA, but for Virginia Tech and for the state of Virginia.
Oh, absolutely. Tech we were handling Tech pretty easily every year, and I think that's really what was the catalyst for Virginia Tech not wanting to get too far behind the eight ball. So yeah, we can kind of thank Coach Welsh for maybe reviving one. Tech had a fairly decent program, and building another one in the state of Virginia. So kind of going back to some memories, you talked about, and I do remember the game that George was referring to when he talked to Jerry Radcliffe about he kind of being on a hot seat that '84 season. I don't really know if he was or not, but I remember the game at Tech, and I don't know if any Virginia fan that's close to can ever forget this. And all you have to do to jot some memories is to say 4th and 1, which was more like 4th and inches. And Chris, I don't know if you remember what I'm speaking about.
I do remember exactly what you're talking about. Yes.
We were driving down. I think we were trailing in that game about 4 or 5 points, and was inside the Tech 25, maybe 30-yard line, and Tech had held us. We were facing a 4th and inches play, and Tech had pretty much put everybody up on the line of scrimmage to stop that 4th and inch play, and George called a pass from Don Mikowski to John Ford that went into the end zone for a touchdown. We held on and won that game. That may have been, in my memory, I'm a 61-year-old person right now, that may be the greatest memory of ever Virginia football history. That afternoon in Blacksburg, it was a cold, rainy day. I had gone down with the editor of the News Virginia, Tim Gordon. And I'll never forget it. It was one of those plays that you kind of look back on, and it kind of developed and it was like it was in freeze frame, slow motion, expecting a handoff, but not getting it. Watching Mikowski seemingly take just inching back into the pocket and then hitting forward and stride down the sidelines for a touchdown. It was just incredible. I'll never forget it. If I live to 100, I'll never forget that moment.
I'm reading some stuff here as we're talking, and I got a big smile on my face reading this now. I'm on Twitter and I'm looking at different people's tributes, and so this one Twitter user Hammy at Lambeth Field says, best quote from George Welsh when Duke Steve Spurrier started to run his mouth about UVA. To set the tone there, longtime UVA fans will remember that Steve Spurrier was at Duke for 3 years, and before Spurrier went to Florida, went to the NFL, went back to South Carolina, whatever. And for 3 years, Spurrier ran his mouth about everything in the ACC. And there was a year that Virginia and Duke finished tied atop the ACC. It was 1989, Virginia's first ACC championship. And Virginia beat Duke handily, 49-27. But Virginia lost to Clemson because Virginia lost to Clemson every year until 1990, 29 straight times losing to Clemson. And Duke beat Clemson that year, and that's why there was a tie atop. Virginia and Duke were both 6-1 in the ACC that year. And Spurrier tried to claim that Duke was the ACC champion because they beat the previous ACC champion, and of course Virginia beat Duke head-to-head. So here's the quote from George, and this is a quote. One thing I could never understand about Steve Spurrier, and you can quote me on this, George said, we scored touchdowns on 7 straight possessions in that game, and it could have been worse. George Welsh. I got a smile on my face, and I have a warm and tingly feeling thinking about George saying that, because that's George also. We love George. George was a grandfatherly type guy, but he could get down to business, and that was George getting down to business.
Yeah, and that big Virginia, the intensity of that rivalry has never been the same since George left. And I remember that game. We could have scored it. George is right. We could have scored every single possession. And he found a way to turn that around on Spurrier.
I wanted to mention this too. When I was sharing some thoughts with my wife this morning, I said one thing that people either don't know, most people wouldn't know, and they have no reason to know, and those who would know don't think about very much, is that George was a pretty good player too. He played at Navy. In 1955, he was an All-American quarterback. He was third in the Heisman voting. He served his time in the Navy afterwards. He went and coached at Penn State for several years under Joe Paterno. I think he was there till 72 or 73. He took over at Navy, and I think it was 73. He took over at Navy as the head coach. So he's back at his alma mater. And they had not had a winning season when he took over since the Staubach era. I think Staubach graduated in 63, or at least his football time at Navy was done in 63. That's about a 10-year period of not winning. He took that program and turned it around. So he's the all-time winningest coach there. He is the all-time winningest coach at Virginia. And but yeah, he was a great accomplished athlete. He was third in the Heisman voting. I mean, in 55. Well, I don't know. I was going to say it maybe wasn't as big a deal then. It probably was a bigger deal then because, in the 50s, college football was huge. It was a huge sport. It was bigger than the NFL in the 50s. And so George, I mean, you look at him and you remember the guy who stood on the sidelines and threw his hat and was quirky and everything else, but he could ball. And so, and I was reading some other quotes. Bill Curry, the former Georgia Tech coach, former Alabama coach, longtime ESPN commentator, talked about coaching against him, and he said that George reminded him of his own coach, and I guess he played for Bear Bryant at Alabama, and saying that remember the early teams in Alabama, Bryant would say, the other team's bigger than us, they're faster than us, but we got one advantage: we're smarter than they are. He said one thing about George Welsh was he was smarter than everybody else he coached against. And so whenever Bill Curry coached against George Welsh, he knew he was at a disadvantage because George, X's and O's wise, psychology wise, he knew how to get the most out of his players. And so other coaches recognized that they had a battle against Virginia, even if maybe they felt like they had more talent in the field, that guy on the sidelines knew what he was doing and could put his guys in the right places. So all these things, these are great tributes for George Welsh, a man that built our program from nothing and turned it into a great program.
In 55, Chris, he finished third in the Heisman. The Heisman Award winner that year was Hopalong Cassidy from Ohio State University. He was a good, a great college football player. You wouldn't have, he wasn't a big player by any means, but he was a competitor, and I think. One of his great quotes, and I was not at this press conference, but it's on YouTube. If you ever want to look it up, you can look up the introductory press conference, and they did it in U-Haul, in the basement of U-Haul in the old media room, because Scott Stadium was just deplorable. I don't think there was such a facility in Scott Stadium that would have been adequate to hold that. But when he was introduced by the athletic director of Virginia at the time, which I believe was Dick Schultz. And one of the reporters asked him, what was the motivation? What was the big factor leaving Navy and coming to Virginia? And did he realize he was coming to Virginia, which had earned the moniker? What did you think about that? That Virginia had earned in football as the graveyard of coaching. And he paused, George paused, and as I said, I was not there, but you can find this on YouTube, and he said, wow, well, it's a pretty nice graveyard. And that's George. And he was a gentleman from wasn't, he had some quirks. He tossed his hat, he picked his nose. I read something that tomorrow at JPJ, I'm sure they'll have a moment of silence. Everyone has to be a moment of silence on it, take their hats off and throw it in the air. He was a unique coach. I had the pleasure of meeting him a number of times and hearing about some of his recruiting adventures through a good friend of mine that happened to be an assistant at the time with George for many years. Danny Wilmer, and man, we could go on and on about recruiting stories about the two of them when they went on the road. And I guess the statute of limitations are up now, so I could probably tell some of them without any risk of getting Danny in any trouble.
Yeah, tell the one, and this is one that UVA fans love telling about Heath Miller. The story of Heath Miller's recruitment is among the more legendary in UVA football circles.
Well, and I've read some of these, and have not, as I said, having heard it from the source, directly from the source. Some of these might, I think a lot of people think that some of these stories might be like something that of urban legend, but so he was an acclaimed quarterback in high school, and why not? At his size, at a small school, Swords Creek High School, which is about as far southwest Virginia. I think it's so far southwest Virginia that it's in Tennessee or Kentucky. It's mind-boggling how far the state runs that direction. But Heath was a great high school quarterback, and he made it known in his family that that's the position he intended to play in college. And I think a lot of coaches backed off a little bit because they just didn't see Keith being nimble enough, being quick enough, being fast enough, agile enough, whatever you want to say, to ever stand a chance to be a quarterback, especially at the D1 level. But on the recruiting trip to have the in-home visits to meet with the Millers, Coach Welsh, Coach Wilmer, driving down there, Coach Wilmer said he was expecting to discuss strategy the whole time, and there was never any strategy. Listened to the radio, talked about other things, never really discussed strategy until they got within about 5 minutes of his house. And Coach Wilmer said, how are we going to do this, Coach? Because we know he can't play quarterback. We know his family, his parents want him to play quarterback in college. What kind of strategy are we going to use? And Coach Welsh, without even breaking stride, just looked and said, well, tell him he can play quarterback. So I think upon hearing that pretty much sealed the deal. Heath Miller was going to come to UVA, and he was going to be the greatest quarterback in ever. I guess comparing him now would probably be like he would probably be a Ben Roethlisberger type quarterback. But when it was apparent that's all they needed to say, he could play quarterback. They shook hands, left, was driving back. Again, not much said until an hour or so into the trip, and Coach Danny Wilmer said to George, so you really think he can play quarterback? And Coach basically, without breaking stride, said, hell no, he's going to be a tight end.
And I can confirm the story. Don't feel like you're saying anything is out of turn. I've seen and heard Frank Beamer tell a similar story from his perspective. They were upfront about saying, hey, Heath, we're going to have you play tight end, and Heath was not happy about that. And I'm reading a story actually on the Virginia Sports website. They don't tell it exactly that way, but they confirmed that he showed up at Virginia thinking he was going to be a quarterback, and he played tight end. So he had a tight end jersey hanging in his locker. So, but that's and of course it worked out for Heath. George knew what he was talking about. Heath Miller, a Hall of Fame career with the Pittsburgh Steelers. So it's okay. It worked out for Heath in that respect. I wanted to read some tributes that we collected, and we posted these to our website. And some of these will spark some memories too. Tiki Barber. I'm saddened to learn the death of the passing of a great man, my UVA football coach, George Welsh. He had his quirks that would make us laugh, but he was such a strong teacher and motivator and always got the best out of us. Thomas Jones, who, gosh, talk about a loaded backfield. Thomas Jones was Tiki's backup before Tiki went to the NFL. That was a pretty good backfield because both these guys had 10-plus year careers in the NFL as very productive, good NFL running backs. Thomas says, deeply saddened to hear the news of the passing of George Welsh. He came to Appalachia, Virginia, sat in my living room, and told me I would play as a true freshman, and he would give me every opportunity to make the NFL. The best coach I ever played for, rest well, Coach Welsh. Thomas Jones played a long time in the NFL. That's big news from him. Good tribute from him. Elton Brown, another guy, played in the NFL for a long time. The man who first noticed a young kid from Newport News, Virginia, and extended an opportunity for me to better myself and my future. This hurts. Rest in paradise, Coach. Elton Brown, one of the all-time greats in UVA football, another Virginia guy, of course, another guy from the state of Virginia. Marcus Hagans, a man who spoke very few words but impacted so many lives. Although I never got to play for Coach, Hagans was recruited, and when George retired in 2000, he played for Al Grove. But thank you for being the first to believe I could play quarterback on the college level. We'll miss you, Coach Welsh. And, of course, Marcus Hagans ends up playing the NFL as well as a wide receiver, but he did play quarterback for a couple of years at UVA. And George Welsh, it sounds like from that story, Scott, that he got Marcus Hagans come to UVA telling him he's going to play quarterback too. Boy, there were a lot of quarterbacks in that class that ended up playing other positions. Amon Hawkins, folks might remember Amon Hawkins, of course. He's got the I Am Ball Hawk podcast that's pretty popular. But Ahmad made the famous catch to beat Virginia Tech in 1998. Forever grateful for Coach. And he has a podcast out, which I'll tease. He shares memories of his former coach and a lot of praise for that podcast out there. Bronco Mendenhall sharing his thoughts. I'm saddened to hear that Coach Welsh passed away this week. My condolences go out to his family. He was a true pioneer for UVA football, provided the model of success we are working hard to replicate. We will miss his frequent visits to the football offices. Bronco Mendenhall wins a bowl game in his third year as head coach, so following the line of George Welsh. And I'll share one more. Carla Williams also had a nice tweet. I cherish the opportunity to visit with Coach about UVA football. I asked a ton of questions, and he graciously answered all of them. And that wasn't even the one I was going to share. The other was from Vince Breedis, who is the football SID at UVA. And he talked about how he never worked as the SID when George was the coach at UVA. But he said George called often to ask questions about how things were going. And he said his most vivid memory of Coach was in 2016, Broncos' first year. And he says he picks the phone up, and it's Coach Welsh, and all he says is, hey, did they name a quarterback yet? So 2016, and George is still that tied into it that he wants to know who the quarterback's going to be. So lots of nice tributes out there. There's so many more out there on Twitter, and nice memories of Coach. So Scott, this is a sad day. This is he was one of the giants. If there's a Mount Rushmore of UVA sports, this guy is one of the cornerstones of that Mount Rushmore of UVA sports.
Oh, for sure. If he's not on it, then they need to tear it down, because he was symbolic of UVA's university. It was a shame for me when he left, because I knew what he had done to the program, and I wasn't one of those fans that was not content winning 7 games a year. I was very happy with that, because I could see the landscape of college football changing. And one of my friends had asked me this morning when we were talking about it, and they said, let me ask you a question. Would George have been as successful today coaching in the landscape of college football as we know it as he was? Would he have had as much success, do you think? And my response would tell you, he probably would have had more. That George would have been successful in whatever era he was coaching, just to his approach to the game and always having his players prepared. Chris, you probably don't remember, you may not remember much about it, but because you were younger. But yeah, we lost games. But I can't remember many games that I would say we lost because we weren't prepared. We lost games because we were playing teams that had better athletes. We lost some games because of some bad breaks, but there were very few games that I would walk away from and say we should have won that game. We would have won that game had we been better. That wasn't what Coach Welsh was about. When the team took the field, they were prepared to win.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Think back to that 95 game against Florida State. Virginia had some good players on that team, but that was Florida State at the height of its powers. And there were some individual play calls in that game that were so interesting. That long pass, I think it was Petey Allen who called an 80-yard touchdown pass on a 3rd and 10 from the 20-yard line. Little things like Little things like that. And that game, we remember that Warwick Dunn was tackled at the inch line, basically on the final play of the game. But what you don't remember necessarily is that Anthony Poindexter was part of that group. He was a freshman that year, and he was playing linebacker. I mean, Poindexter, of course, makes his name known later on as a safety, but they were trying to get him on the field, and they got him on the field as a linebacker, an undersized linebacker. Get him on the field because he could tackle and he had speed and he had enough size and things like that. Playing guys out of position just to get them on the field, and I'll never, just for me as a guy who bleeds orange and blue. It was only 3 weeks, but 3 weeks is number one in the country. They'll never take those away from us. We can say that, and Virginia Tech can't. They've never been number one in football. That's the sport they love the most. They've never been number one in football, and George got us there. George had us believe in every year you knew you'd win 7 games, and then every 3 or 4 years you'd make a run at something, And I remember this too. In '98, that team started 5-0. Ranked as high, I want to say as high as number 5 or number 6 in the country. Had that lead at Georgia Tech. God forbid Georgia Tech blast them. 38-17 lead, late third quarter. We're driving. Aaron Brooks fumbles. They pick it up and run it back for a touchdown. Eventually come back and win 41-38. Damn that score. That's the same score we lost in 1990 to Georgia Tech. But leaving the field that day, and I wasn't covering that game. That was a game in Atlanta. I didn't make road trips back then a lot. But the cameras caught George walking off the field, and it looked like to me he had tears in his eyes. And it said to me, actually I said this out loud when I saw it, he knows this was his last chance. I mean, we knew his career was coming to an end. At that stage, he was 65 years old, and he was 5-0, and that team was loaded. Aaron Brooks was the quarterback. Thomas Jones was the running back. I mean, it was a damn good team. And he's walking off the field, and I'm thinking, because he knew every 3 or 4 years, we were going to make a run, and that was going to be it for him. And of course, he retires 2 years later. So, the intervening years. I mean, now we're on a good track with Bronco, and Bronco's going to get us moving forward. I think next year looks great and that kind of thing. But for the longest time in between, that magic that we had when you knew you'd win 7, and every couple of years you'd make a run at an ACC title, maybe make a run at being ranked in the top 10, top 5. We took that for granted. I feel bad, Scott. I don't know how many people out there remember this. The young fans wouldn't remember this because you have no reason to. I felt like he kind of got ran off from that job because all he did was win 7 games every year. That was the talk. The internet was still relatively new in 2000. The message boards were still a new phenomenon. And people complained endlessly that all we did was win 7 games every year. In fact, his last year we only won 6 games. And I felt like we ran him off. I guess he was 67 years old when he retired. And what a shame that we did that to a guy without whom none of this happens. We're not talking about Bronco Mendenhall. We're not talking about playing games in front of a half-empty stadium. Scott Stadium doesn't get expanded if not for George Welsh. And I kind of feel like we didn't treat him right on the way out.
Well, and I think there's a lot of people that just think that way that follow Virginia football, that we may have gotten a little greedy and we thought that there was someone better out there that could take us beyond winning 7, 8 games a year. In fact, at one point we had the longest streak in the nation of consecutive seasons of 7 or 8 wins or more, I believe. When we were among the leaders. And remember, too, that was during an 11-game season, not a 12-game season. So we were constantly 7-4, 8-3 or better. Yeah. So that needs to be taken into consideration. I hope that we didn't run him off. I think that we probably a similar situation to what happened down in Blacksburg with Coach Beamer a couple years ago. And, you and I talked about there's some eerie resemblance of what happened, what's happening in Blacksburg now, that what happened in Charlottesville after Coach Welsh was sort of, I don't want to say run off, but allowed to leave or maybe encouraged to leave. with the exception of the first couple of years when Al Groh took over, mostly with players recruited by George Welsh, such as Heath Miller, Matt Schaub, those type of players. We went into the dark ages soon thereafter, and things are unfolding similarly down in Blacksburg. So I guess you got to be careful that be careful what you ask for, because we certainly have not come close to sustaining what we had with Coach Welsh since he left. And one thing I am very pleased to read from Coach Mendenhall when he was tweeting his condolences to the Welsh family, talking about what a pioneer for Virginia football he was, and that current staff is working hard to replicate that. And if we can get back to that with Coach Mendenhall, then I think Coach Welsh is going to be smiling down on this program.
Yeah, I'll go back to finishing up my thought on how I feel like we ran him off. I covered Al Groh's introductory press conference. It was a big event at the time. I guess I was in Scott Stadium, and in this big room full of half the people were New York writers who were asking him why he left the Jets, and the other half were those of us covering Virginia who were wowed by the fact that UVA hired an NFL coach. And I guess folks might remember, it would be hard not to remember, that I wrote critically a lot of Al Groh in that era, and it started that first day because he goes into that room. Now, we just said, Virginia had a run of 13 straight years with 7 or more wins, 10 bowl appearances in that period of time. And George coached Virginia to 12 bowl games, again, a program that had never been to a bowl game before he was coach there. And so Al Groh comes in and he's pointing out, I want to say the national championship game that had just played a week or two before the announcement of hiring was Florida State, Oklahoma. And so Al Groh makes the point, we just saw what happens, how you can beat Florida State. You just have to have players as good as Oklahoma. You can't win championships if you don't set your sights on winning championships, and we're going to do that here now. And he was playing into that narrative. All we do is win 7 games. We're going to do better than that. Well, it didn't quite work out. Now I'm going to take it back to positive. A couple years later, we had a game, maybe in the 2001 season, a game in Scott Stadium against Georgia Tech, and the big video boards up there at that point, and they used to do. It's been years since they've done this really, but they used to do in the pregame video board message, they would have a celebrity come in and kind of swat the other team's mascot or whatever. So of course the Georgia Tech bees buzzing around the rotunda, and then next person on the screen is the least person you would ever expect to be anything humorous or anything like that. It's Coach Welsh. He's in the rotunda, and the Georgia Tech bee is buzzing around, and George throws his hat at the bee and kills it. And that is the classic, because he threw his hat. A generation of us still throw our hats. My wife does not let me wear a hat watching TV when I'm watching Virginia play any sport, because if I've got a hat, I'm going to throw it, because that's what George did. I just learned from George. Bad lesson, but I learned it. And so he threw the hat at the bee, and he killed it. And then we all just, the place erupted. I'll never forget. I got the hair standing on the back of my neck right now thinking about how loud that place got when George threw that hat at the Georgia Tech bee. And Virginia won that game, and people might remember this game. I think this was actually Groh's first year, now that I think about it. It was 2001. That was not a very good team for Virginia, but Georgia Tech had a good team that year. The quarterback was like Joe Hamilton. He was a Heisman Trophy candidate. Virginia is losing 38-33 in the fourth quarter, got the ball with about 30 seconds left, and Matt Schaub, hook and ladder. I think Billy McMullen caught the pass, and then I want to say it was Alvin Pearman. He flipped the hook and ladder to. And at the 30-yard line, and you could see it, it was going to be a touchdown. And Virginia's got this 39-38 lead, and of course at that stage you go for 2. If you get the 2, it's 41-38. I just mentioned we lost 2 games at Georgia Tech that killed 2 possible championship seasons by a 41-38 score. How fitting would this be? But it is UVA. We didn't get the 2. We did win the game 39-38. George killed the bee with a hat. It was one of the greater nights in UVA football, even though that was a terrible team. We beat Georgia Tech And I think that's the night they unveiled the statue of George there at Scott Stadium. It was a hell of a night. And so we maybe didn't treat him right on the way out, but that was a great night. And ever since, George has been that beloved figure that we all felt sorry for, that what he had spent 18 years building up over the past 18 years had sort of died down. I'd like to think, Scott, and this is corny as hell for me to say, it's very corny for me to say because the man just passed away. But I hope he got to watch the Belk Bowl. I hope he got to watch a lot of football this season. I'm sure he did. And it may be just a sliver of nice thoughts for him to see this team winning again, winning and playing good football again, winning a bowl game before he goes to the next phase. Maybe there's something to that. Maybe, he got to enjoy a little bit of UVA football before he passed away. I hope so.
Well, we don't know what his health was like the last couple of weeks, but hopefully he did, and we can all just keep that in spirit in our thoughts and just say we think he did. And that little stint that he did on the scoreboard about killing Georgia Tech, the Yellow Jacket, I would say that is as grandiose of a spectacle as George Welsh ever once made of himself while at UVA. That's about as much as you're going to get him to take center spotlight. And I remember, one last thing about that press conference that Al broke, his introductory press conference, which I was present for. The one thing that Al takes a lot of these, and we critique him a lot. Some, I guess, a lot justifiable. But the one thing that he was the man of his word, because the one thing he made it clear at that press conference was that he didn't come to Virginia to win ACC championships. And you know what? He lived up to that, didn't he, Chris?
He did. Let me share some things. I'm reading David Teal's Twitter now, and there's some good things here. David Teal said he spoke with Coach Welsh this past fall, and he was still very much keeping up with things. So he was keeping up with the football program and his beloved Hoos. Some quotes from players that talked to David Teal. Chris Slade. Here's a good one. Chris Slade. Let me just, before I say this about what Chris Slade said about Coach Welsh, I had a couple of classes with Chris Slade when I was at UVA, and the first time he sat down beside me, I felt this presence beside me. Chris Slade had muscles in places people don't have places, as they say. He had veins popping out of his arms in places that you're not supposed to have blood flowing through. This man, he was a walking, like, an anatomical chart. The biggest, most fit human being I've ever been anywhere near. Chris Slade. I say that to say this. This is what he said about George Welsh to David Teal. That guy, you didn't want to mess with him. For a guy his size, when he walked in a room, you thought it was Andre the Giant. He had a presence about him. He scared the crap out of people. The biggest guys on our team were scared of him. Now, George was a little guy. You said that earlier, Scott. That's Chris Slade saying that about George Welsh. The biggest guys on our team were scared, had the crap scared out of him, but them by him. So that's a nice tribute. One other I thought I'd share. This is from Sean Moore. Sean Moore was a Heisman Trophy candidate his senior year at UVA. He was the quarterback of the team that was number 1 for 3 weeks. We knew we were good. We felt like we were rock stars. George had a way of humbling us all. Those make me tear up as much as these other stories, because that's what we loved about George, is that it didn't matter if you were Sean Moore, Heisman Trophy candidate, Chris Slade, played in the NFL for a long time, biggest man I've ever seen in person in my life. You still had to play for Coach Welsh.
Yeah, it didn't matter. I mean, he was a disciplinarian from how you practice to what took place on the field on Saturdays. And hopefully this is, like Coach Mendenhall said, this is what the current staff is trying to replicate. And if that is indeed true, then we've got a lot of fun afternoons in the fall to look forward to.
I'm seeing some movement on Twitter from both Navy and UVA alums talking about the possibility of developing a annual series again. And UVA and Navy played annually for a long time after Coach Welsh got the job at UVA. But reviving that series and having a George Welsh trophy to the winner, and that would be a nice tribute. Hopefully, I mean, I love the idea, and that'd be something nice to do in his memory. Also, it'd be a pretty good game because the two programs are good programs. And that's what I guess to bring it to that current. We were talking about this a few minutes ago, Scott, but to bring it back to the current, Bronco Mendenhall faces some of the same situations that Coach Welsh faced when he took the job over. They both inherited a very empty cupboard. By year 3, they had won a bowl game, facing the same challenges with the academic institution. It's hard to get kids admitted. You got to be careful who you recruit, they both. I like to think that maybe Coach Mendenhall's career at UVA can take a similar track. Obviously, we would all be beneficial if it could take a similar track as Coach Welsh's did at Virginia. That would mean in a few years we'll be number 1. That would be awesome. But I guess if I could say anything about George Welsh's influence on me and the way I see UVA sports, you look at the current coaches that we deal with, and we don't deal with all 30-plus coaches at UVA, but the ones that we deal with and most fans would recognize, Brian O'Connor, the baseball coach, Tony Bennett, the basketball coach, now Bronco Mendenhall, the football coach. George set the standard. He was a well-spoken man, a graduate of the Naval Academy, who recruited athletes who themselves were well-spoken and academic young men. Terry Kirby and Chris Slade were valedictorians of their classes in high school. We had scholar athletes up and down the roster. Tom Burns is a nuclear engineer, among many. Charles Way was an engineering student at UVA. He was my best friend. He was his engineering lab partner, and they played football. And they played good football. Charles Way played in the NFL for 10 years. So he recruited smart kids who played football well. Some of whom who went to the NFL. All of whom are doing well in life. And Coach O'Connor, Coach Bennett, Coach Mendenhall. I think the nicest thing I can say about those 3 men is that they embody what George Welsh tried to bring to Virginia, and the standard he set, and Terry Holland as well, for how a coach should act, and how they should recruit, and how they should win, and winning clean. And so that's the nice thing I can say about O'Connor and Mendenhall and Bennett is that they live up to, in my opinion, they live up to the ideal that George Welsh set at UVA Sports.
It was pulled out some souvenirs of mine, Chris, and the Daily Progress the day after Coach Welch announced his retirement, and big picture of him on the front page, and it says, fittingly, "I will forever be a who." So now that forever is eternity. And he was 67. That's not old enough. There's college coaches now that are Mike Brown comes to mind that are still coaching, getting jobs. Coach probably could have gone somewhere else had he wanted to. He was content to end his coaching career at Virginia. He never sought out other jobs. I don't know if a lot of people know this, but he was brought on when ODU started their football program. He was brought on as a consultant and actually recommended the hiring of Bobby Wilson, the current coach, Bobby Wilson, who's currently still there at ODU.
Yeah.
So he, we kind of forgot about that. He kind of built 2 programs, UVA and ODU. Virginia's had a long losing streak to Tech, but he had to get some satisfaction out of what happened last fall when ODU went down to, Tech went to Norfolk and got crushed by the Monarchs.
Well, this is This is a sad day for UVA Nation. It's one of those days that we want to honor a man who we felt like did a lot of good things. And of course, we're talking about the sports and everything else, but all the young men that he coached, you're seeing so many of them, the outpourings on social media, and when they're being contacted by reporters for comments. Again, there's a lot of guys that are doing great things in the world, including having played football at UVA and maybe the NFL, that were impacted by George Welsh's life. And so that's why we want to do this tribute to George Welsh and personally say thank you, Coach, for a lot of great Saturdays, a few Thursdays, and a lot of memorable bowl games, and for for making it possible for us to, all these many years later, still enjoy UVA sports. I don't think that UVA sports is anywhere near where it is now, and not just football. Football being the cash cow for all sports. If UVA football doesn't have that run for almost 20 years, who knows where we are everywhere else. So thanks, Coach Welsh, for everything you did, and RIP.